important. And we're very, very, very proud of that. We don't take anything for granted. Lots of attempts have been made over the years to try and move production out of the UK to other plants in Europe. And this government in Westminster, I think, is just beginning to get the message that unless they continue to invest in aerodynamic technology, we won't be building the wings in 50 years' time. So it is really a long game in aerospace. It takes a long time to die, but you may have already started. That's the message. This is a photograph, really, which kind of draws the difference between this aeroplane and the Comet airliner. This aeroplane carries between 500, 600 and possibly even 800 if you pack them in tight enough. The Comet, which some of you may remember from historical films, was the world's first jet airliner, and it was British. And it carried between 30 and 40 people. So the scope of the industry has changed enormously in that time. But the basic design actually hasn't changed that much. One of the things that is significantly different is the size and power and fuel efficiency of those engines. So a tremendous amount has gone into the evolution of the technologies. This is a picture of the former economics minister, one Andrew Davis, who was here earlier on, and the former manager of GE at Nant Garw in South Wales, discussing some issue. I say former, not because they were actually killed when the engine was switched on, because you've seen Andrew here this afternoon, but they have moved on to other jobs. I still think they should have been wearing hard hats, high-vis jackets and safety boots. And if Andrew had been here, I would have told him that. But the message here is that here in Wales, there is a very strong link between the government and industry. And Aerospace Wales Forum, if you like, sits at that junction between the two. But we've always had good support, and particularly when Andrew was around and Rodri Morgan, although I think Carwyn Jones and Edwina Hart are also now starting to get the message that aerospace is an important industry. And Tim Williams, my colleague from the Automotive Forum, and we share a building down in Bridgend in South Wales. We're good friends, aren't we, Tim?
Up until this slide.
Up until this slide. One of the messages I want to get across is that aerospace is a very complex industry. The part count, if you like, of an aeroplane is much higher than a car. That's not to say that cars are easy. I'm sure they're not. But in terms of pound for pound, an aero engine has the same weight as silver, whereas a car, it's merely the same as a hamburger. However, as Tim will go on to say in his presentation, if he stays, automotive is doing a lot in technology now, which is common to aerospace. We both have issues around fuel efficiency, new fuels, exotic materials, which lighter, much lighter than the current ones we use, and trying all the time to reduce costs. And I think you've even come up with a way of using old hamburgers as fuel.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So this is fantastic stuff. Wales, this is the country where you live. Most of the industry, as with all of our industries, tends to be concentrated along the north coast and the south coast, with really the concentration being in the northeast around the Airbus plant, and the southeast around Cardiff Airport and the nearby St Athan maintenance, repair and overhaul facility. But there are bits spread all over the place. Up here, a particular note is RAF Whalley, which I think employs something like 600 people maintaining the RAF's Hawk fleet and other aircraft there. And most of those people come from the island of Anglesey. So I think it probably makes it the largest private sector employer on the island. One of the other advantages of Wales is there's not a lot here in the middle. So as well as beautiful countryside, beautiful beaches, we're also developing a capability to test fly unmanned air vehicles off the west coast of Wales at Parc Aberporth. A little bit of history about the Aerospace Wales Forum. It's been going since 2002, 150 member companies. We work in very close cooperation with the UK's National Trade Association, ADS, and also the other UK regional associations as well. So we're very well networked. It's not about Fortress Wales, it's about making sure that Wales is a key team player, not just in Aerospace UK, but in aerospace worldwide. Industry, and despite our best efforts, people say, what aerospace industry? Well, By the time you've added in Airbus, Hawker Beechcraft, Raytheon, EADS, British Airways, who have a big maintenance base in South Wales, we're turning over something like 5 billion. That's probably an underestimate now. Over 160 companies, 25,000 people directly employed, and some really big names. So we punch above our weight in this sector. Going back now to the beginning of this century, this whole industry in the UK was facing some real challenges. We were starting to lose work, not to low-cost countries, but to the United States. The United States is the biggest aerospace industry in the world. It has the biggest aerospace industry in the world. We have the second biggest, surprisingly enough. We just beat the French by a smidgen. But we are second with about a 17% share of world aerospace, which is pretty significant. But around the turn of the century, we were starting to lose work from some of our smaller companies, not to China or India, but to US companies. So the industry sat down and said, look, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to work together? Because it's not in our interest, this is the big companies, that we see all of our supply chain wiped out. But at the moment, the message was, you're not performing well enough. Your on-time delivery, your quality, responsiveness, whatever you want to measure, isn't meeting the requirements of a modern industry. When we built the Comet, I wasn't there personally, but when we built the Comet back in the early 50s, the aircraft length varied by 18 inches. That was the degree of interchangeability. So if you wanted to fit a new door, you couldn't just go up and fit it. You had to get your old file out and file it down until it fitted correctly. Now we have Lean Six Sigma. Everything is very precision engineered. But it's not enough. We've got to continually drive improvement. So around about the turn of the century, when Labour were in power, Patricia Hewitt, the then Secretary of State for Department of Trade and Industry, launched something called the Aerospace Innovation and Growth Team. So again, collaboration, government, industry, academics sitting down and saying, what are we going to do over the next 20 years? So they carved out a plan for 2000 to 2020, and we're now halfway through that plan. Similarly, the new government, which has just come in, has also discovered that aerospace is important, and they've formed an aerospace growth partnership. Similar idea, basically, and the same thing is happening in automotive on both occasions, both in 2000 and now. But out of that programme came something called SC21, which was Supply Chains 21, and this was an initiative driven and shared by all of the major aerospace companies in the UK, trying to come up with a framework that would help establish a common language and establish a common drive for improvement within the industry. And it built on lots of things that were already existing. DTI had thousands of initiatives. There was something called the Lean Aerospace Initiative, which had originally come out of the US. There was something called supply chain relationships in aerospace, which was a code of conduct for how you deal with people in the supply chain in that particular sector. I have to say it got a bad name in the period we're looking at because it was rechristened Screw You, because that was the view that most of the smaller companies had of the bigger companies. So why SC21? Well, customers are demanding more affordable and innovative solutions. We're in a great industry, but airlines are struggling to make money. The big companies are also struggling to make money. They say it's only the small companies who are making money, but the small companies dispute that. But you know, the old joke was, how do you make a large fortune in aerospace? Sorry, how do you earn a small fortune in aerospace? You start off with a large fortune, because lots of people are losing lots of money. One of the key drivers, though, is that the primes and OEMs want fewer direct suppliers. If you go into automotive, I guess about 20 years ago, you were doing very much the same kind of thing. Aerospace, in fact, has probably lagged automotive in terms of the rationalisation of its supply chain. That's largely driven by the fact that there isn't or hasn't been the overcapacity in aerospace that there appears to be in automotive. So I couldn't get rid of this supplier because they were the only one I could find. That is changing. There is more competition. There are emerging countries like China, India, Brazil, which are developing very capable aerospace industries. Mexico, Morocco, are now starting to join that band of countries. So I think there was a recognition that we needed to do something very different. There was also a recognition as well that on the defence side, it was all very haphazard and chaotic, and we needed to decide which bits of industry we wanted to support in future. So all of that came together and really sort of provided the foundation for SC21. Some obvious things here. We need to work together to increase efficiency, remove repetition, plan and communicate better, earlier in the life cycle and then right through the life cycle. So in 2006, all of those companies on the left, the ones in red are the bigger companies. The ones in white are some of the smaller companies who are in the foundation group. Now, since then, this has expanded to 600 member companies. But in the first place, it was the big companies and a few smaller companies to keep them on the straight and narrow, because I worked for a big company and we thought we understood supply chains. We didn't. You don't understand supply chains until you've been in one. And basically, they signed up to a program, a well-defined program, which was all about business transformation, accelerating change and continuous improvement through life management, and a key leadership role as far as these companies were concerned. Again, coming back to the SCREA program, it was recognised that the traditional adversarial approach to procurement wasn't working. I have to say, there's still a lot of that about. I'm not going to try and kid anyone. What the guys at the top say and what some of the Rottweilers say in procurement haven't changed that much. But they are changing. More about trying to integrate companies into value chains rather than supply chains. We've already heard some of that through the rail sector and through what happened at Transfinith on the nuclear side. There's a recognition that and some of this came from the oil and gas industry in the 80s and 90s. You know, if you've got an oil rig and it's spewing oil out, or it's not spewing any oil at all, you are losing millions of pounds. And you can't afford to sue people, go through the fine print in the contract. You've got to say, we are a team, we have to carry the risks and rewards together. So this whole concept of collaboration through alliancing, much closer commercial cooperation, started to emerge. And we've really picked it up fairly late in aerospace, although Airbus itself is a clear example and successful example of how that worked with the bigger companies. We're now starting to look at how it works with the smaller companies. SC21 focused on some fairly low-hanging fruit, things like accreditation. If you ever get involved in the aerospace supply chain, we have approvals coming out of our ears. Some companies are being assessed and audited virtually every week by different companies. So one of the things we've attempted to do, and again with mixed success, is to try and reduce that repetition. The other thing was that all the big companies were coming along with their own improvement program, continuous improvement program. This is what you should do. This is the Rolls-Royce way. This is the Airbus way. And again, companies were getting so much help, they were drowning. So again, the SC21 has tried to rationalise that process. Relationships, key element, and measurement of performance. Performance in the aerospace supply chain was appalling. It's not particularly good now, but it's much better than it was. But the sort of 99%, 0.999 on time deliveries, reliabilities, quality, etc., have not yet been achieved in aerospace industry. Delivery can still be way down. You know, sometimes 80%, 85% schedule adherence, which is intolerable in terms of the production rates that we now face. I talked about alliancing. One of the areas which first started to take up this whole idea of putting together collaborative organisations to deliver contracts was the Ministry of Defence. For years it had worked with a very hands-off, select a prime contractor, they would then select subcontractors, you know, and there would be contract upon contract, added cost upon added cost, and delivery never happened. about 10 years ago, they started to look at alliancing in the serious way. One of the first projects they looked at was for the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. These are the ships that provide support to the Royal Navy, so things like tankers, supply ships, for example. They're not the most glamorous of ships, and therefore they don't get top priority in terms of expenditure, but they were getting to the point where they were no longer serviceable, they were no longer repairable. So MOD took a decision that it would run the contract for the Royal Fleet Auxiliary replacement using an alliancing approach. And it worked up to a point, except it got to a point where it went into a political decision box and never came out again. And the whole thing was frozen for about 5 years. But they have now finally made the decision on the procurement of the tanker. But out of that came a new standard, BS 11,000, which is a standard to do with collaboration. We talked this morning a little bit about the NEC contracts, which is also a framework that's been developed within the engineering, the construction, civil engineering businesses, as a set of guidelines for how companies work together. BS 11,000 takes that further. I used to be a quality director. I love standards. There's a lot of good stuff in there, but the language is a bit turgid, I have to say. The original draft was very good, but in trying to make it a bit like an ISO, the language is not what you'd expect, I think. But nevertheless, it's a good read if you have a sleepless night, and it is increasingly now being called up in procurement contracts. On the rail sector, for example, Network Rail, I think, are going to be using BS 11,000 as one of the requirements. We've heard how alliancing type structures are starting to emerge in the rail sector. We talked about SC21. At the same time that the UK was looking at a Supply Chains 21 programme, the equivalent of Aerospace Wales, just over the border in northwest England, was developing its own version of SC21, which went much further. If you like, SC21 sits down at the left-hand side of this picture, getting a common language, using common processes, common improvement type programs. But what the Northwest Aerospace Alliance programme did, and it's been funded by UK and European funds over the last 5 years or so, was to try and build groups of companies. So they put together commodity groups operating in similar areas of technology like structures or UAVs or design, for example. They also looked at the idea of using more shared services. Now, initially it's things like paperclips, but ultimately it's down to things like HR, way beyond the sort of traditional stuff. And then the ultimate aim is the idea of developing the extended enterprise. The phrase is used in many different ways, but what I'm talking about here is almost loose associations of organisations which can quickly come together to deliver a particular contract, and there are proper commercial frameworks in place and the culture in place to allow that to happen. So the commodity groups really are the first stage, because we talked about culture and behaviour. Again, coming back to the Transfinith experience, lots of concerns, lots of fears about how this works, how this collaboration approach works in practice, and it takes time to develop the behaviours, the cultures that will allow it to happen. And again, BS 11,000 majors on the behavioural side to quite a degree. And why do we need to do this? Well, one of the problems we have in our industry in the UK is, say, compared with German industry, and this isn't just aerospace, is that we tend to have a small number of very, very big companies. We don't tend to have many middle-sized companies. And then we've got lots of small companies. Well, what the Airbuses, Bombardiers, Boeings, BAE Systems of this world are saying is, we don't want to deal with thousands of suppliers, we want to deal with half a dozen. So they're now starting to work with what I call the super tier ones, people like GKN, who are now expanding in aerospace. They've acquired lots of outfits in the States over the last 10 years. Spirit Aerosystems, which is an American company. What the Northwest said was, well, we don't have anybody in the Northwest that fits that bill. So whereas we used to deal directly with Airbus, the question a lot of people ask, how do I get through the front door of Airbus? Well, you won't in future. you will have to deal with the likes of GKN. Unless you've got something pretty unique, a specialised service or product, then you're going to have to find another entry point into the supply chain. The good news is that GKN, in particular, discussions I've had with them recently, they are starting to realise that low-cost sources overseas are not necessarily the answer to all of our problems. So they're looking now at trying to build this collaborative type of relationships within the UK and the European supply chain. And really the aim of the Northwest Aerospace Alliance programme, which some Welsh companies are involved in, is to try and build the teams that can bid for that type of work. And this is the amoeba diagram. All it shows is that the extended enterprise can be very flexible. It's not about 6 companies signing up for life. It's about a group of companies, maybe 30, which say, look, there's this particular project coming up. These 7 are the companies that we will team together to bid for that contract. Lots of different models. We've talked about joint ventures and alliances. One model that comes out is the idea of a lead partner, which is not that different perhaps to having a lead contractor, except that instead of the boxes being separate, they're actually overlaying with each other because they're actually tied together much more in terms of the commercial framework. So you have horizontal and vertical collaboration. So where are we going in future? We've already talked about the Aerospace Growth Partnership, which is looking at the industry now from 2010 to 2030. Aerospace itself will continue to grow. There's no doubt about that. I haven't said anything about the markets for aerospace, but if you want to find out more, there's this excellent book which is available over the web via UK Trade and Investment. It gives a real detailed breakdown of all of the markets, military, civil, helicopters. The real growth is going to come from civil aerospace. At the moment, Airbus and Boeing have something like 5 years backlog. The paradox is they would love to give that work to the UK and the European supply chain. Their fear is that we're not robust enough to react to that. SC-21, ASCII are programs which are helping us respond to that. But the challenge is, we need to move quickly, otherwise it will go to India and China. There are some issues around what I call limits to growth. There's the problem of fuel. There's the problem of pollution. Tim, I think, will talk on some of these issues in his presentation. They are common challenges both to aerospace and to automotive. There are growing opportunities and there are growing competition. We think we're coming up with some new solutions. Technology is going to be really important, but also collaborative working, I think, is a key part of the way the industry will work in future. That's what an aeroplane might look like. That looks pretty futuristic, but in fact, although this is a Boeing design, the prototype for this has already flown, a much scaled-down version, and it was designed and developed in the UK at Cranfield. So the UK is still playing a leading role in the shape of the future. Thank you for listening.